Hi, this is Jeff Pospisil, the 10-Minute Treasurer with practical advice for improving your church's financial future. So this is part of my budgeting series, and I'm talking about planning for fixed costs. And I use the quotes around fixed because I don't ever want us to hold on to anything too tightly. What is true today may not be true tomorrow because the mission always trumps whatever the methods are. An example of this, we had a church that this year they decided to sell off their campus ministry building. They didn't give up on campus ministry, but the building was no longer as useful as they needed it to be. So what was a fixed cost ended up being not fixed anymore. And they changed it. Those don't happen that often, but once you get everything kind of aligned, your personnel, your property, and everything else aligned, your fixed costs are usually fairly stable. So for the church fixed costs, I'm going to talk about specifically personnel, property, and apportionments, or that's for United Methodist, but your denominational or association dues, whatever you call that, though that allegiance to some other group. So these are things that should change seldom and usually not without a lot of forethought going into it. You don't want to make major changes to your property without making sure you thought all the way through the consequences. Same with personnel and apportionments, and you want it to be hopefully aligned everything with your mission. So the first one I'm going to talk about is those denominational or association dues. That is to really should be considered a gift from the church towards the work of God through whatever that association is. In the Dakotas United Methodists, we ask for 16% of your operating income to go towards that work. And I would consider that a fixed cost. So that's an easy one to calculate. If you've already calculated your income, multiply that by 16%. If your denomination or association just gives you those dues, you might just have to look at the history of what they've been charging you and base it on that. So, but whatever that formula is or whatever that trend is, just go ahead and plug that in. That should be considered a fixed cost, almost like a tithe. And our next fixed cost we're going to be talking about is property. And this happens to be a picture of our church in Arlington, South Dakota. And this is not their trustees budget, but this is a typical trustees budget where you have your church expenses, your insurance, your parsonage. And what I like to do is I like to see the last 2 to 3 years of actual expenses. And then I don't get super scientific about this. I don't do anything fancy, but I do look for trends. And if you have a financial mind, you can at least see the trends and look for those. When I'm looking at the trends, I can see the trends really quickly in utilities. There's a definite downward trend. These happen to be actual expenses, so this church, for whatever reason, was seeing a downward trend in their utilities. And unless I have some kind of special knowledge, that's what I'm going to assume, is that we're going to continue that trend. Then there's a couple of these line items where there's really no trend. I mean, if you look at 2 to 3 years, they're up and down. It kind of probably depends on the timing of things and the season and everything else. So I'm just going to choose amount that seems like it's appropriate. It may not be the highest for every given year, but for most years it's going to cover it. And unless everyone is maxed out for that year, it should work. So, and parsonage appliances, since it's just piddly and nothing, I'm just going to group that in with parsonage repairs and maintenance. And then there's insurance. That's a contract. And so for us, it happens to be a 3-year contract. And so I know what that amount's going to be. And so I can just plug that one in. And the last one here is these maintenance ones for the parsonage and the church. And these ones are always tough because there's always that regular maintenance that you just got to do, cleaning the carpets, whatever it is, but then there's always some big thing that happens where you have to replace the flooring or whatever it happens to be. And that blows the budget. So here's my suggestion to you. And I'm going to talk about this in a future video, but budget within your realistic budget amount, budget a little bit on the higher end. And then, so like here, I budgeted 21,000 for the parsonage and the church combined. And whatever is unspent, put that in a savings account. Put that aside in a trustee's savings account. So that way, so like here, I got $21,000 that's budgeted. And if I have another unusual year like 2020 where it's over, I can draw from that. I can spend my budget to the max, but then draw from that to cover the excess expenses. And the last thing is look at the bottom line. Does the bottom line appear to be within reason for what you normally spend? And again, 2020 was a little bit exceptional because we had that larger than average church maintenance expense. But I mean, if your bottom line was significantly higher than it you've ever spent, that's a sign of a problem. Okay, the last section of our fixed costs is our personnel. And since this is the touchiest one, I saved it for last. So this is covering all your employees, your pastor, your secretary, your youth and children, your worship, your custodial, all those different positions, all your paid positions. And there's some of those costs that are given to you, and those are the easy ones. Health insurance usually is, retirement is usually is, especially if it's your pastor. Your pastor just gets those right from the conference office. You know, your payroll taxes are going to stay the same for your non-clergy people, so that's 7.65%. You know, your workers' comp usually doesn't fluctuate a whole lot either. So those are the givens and the easy ones. But talking about salaries and wages, how much do you increase it? Well, the first thing you got to pay attention to is what is the minimum wage. So in South Dakota, ours is adjusted annually according to inflation, and I think it's at $9.30 currently. North Dakota, it's $7.25. That's the federal minimum wage. Pastors in the United Methodist and other denominations, they have a minimum compensation. So we set ours based on a formula, and in the Dakotas, and that's their minimum base salary if they're a full-time pastor. So that's also something to pay attention to. What is the minimum? Again, this isn't you making any decisions yet. It's just how do we stay in compliance. So here's where it gets tricky. When you're paying employees over and above the minimum, and there's nothing that's forcing you to increase it up to what's the new minimum is going to be. There's no statutory requirement, nothing like that. So you have discretion to pay them how much you want to give them an increase, or if you want to give them an increase. And this is assuming that you've done the hard work to figure out exactly what is realistic, how much margin you have to spend, because you know you have a realistic budget. So I'm of the strong opinion that if you are not giving an employee an inflationary or cost of living adjustment, that you're basically giving them a pay cut. So, and it might be appropriate to give somebody a pay cut. But I mean, if you have a good employee that you want to keep, um, then I would encourage you to not cut their pay by giving them a no increase. So what I look at is I look at the consumer price index, and I'll put a link to the calculator for that in the comments. And the other thing I look at is the Social Security does an annual cost of living adjustment. And I look at those two things, and that gives me a good idea of, at least it gives me a good basis of what would be a reasonable adjustment for inflation or cost of living increases. So that's where I would start. Another thing that I found helpful is being able to compare how I'm paying my church staff, how I'm compensating my church staff compared to similar churches in a similar context. So if it's my secretary or my pastor or my youth person, whatever it is, how am I doing compared to other similar churches? And that information is out there. One of the most helpful tools I found is from Richard Hammer, and I'll put the link to this in the notes, but they do an annual survey, State of the Church Compensation Report. Excellent thing. I get it, maybe once every 5 years, just so I got something on me to give me a basis. But it breaks it all the way down to size of church, geography of church, and all these other things, and various positions. Excellent, excellent resource. Another one too, especially for your pastors, is calling your conference office. I mean, we collect all the compensation information for pastors, and this would give you a good idea. Are you being paid? What would be expected? So, as a pastor. So one of the hard things is a lot of us, our churches, we have great pastors and staff, and we don't know if we can sustain a new higher level of compensation. So we don't want to give them too big of a raise because we don't know if we can sustain that going forward. So maybe we just give them the inflationary increase. So what I want you to encourage you is to be open-minded to paying out a bonus. If you come to the end of the year and you have a surplus, and especially a year like this, when so many church staff responded so awesome to the COVID crisis, can we provide a bonus? And it doesn't have to be cash. I'm sure that cash should be appreciated, but what if it's Vikings tickets, or what if it's a membership to the fitness club, or whatever it happens to be? You know your pastors and staff better than I do, but what would be something that maybe we can put a little bit of money for a one-time gift to show our appreciation in a tangible way? So, all right, that brings us to the end. And again, this is a ministry of the Finance Office of the Dakotas Conference, as well as the Dakotas United Methodist Foundation. I encourage you to like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff if this is helpful, and share it as well. If you think this would be helpful to other people that you know, share it. All right, till next time.